I want to thank again the folks that have put this together and just comment really very briefly, extremely briefly, how important and unique this session is. I don't know that I've been at another place, another conference that focused specifically on these type of issues. And then in a short period of time, we've heard about climate change, we've heard about migration, and I'm going to talk a little bit about armed conflict. And all of these are related, and I think are critically important. Is the next challenge for pediatrics and pediatricians, and we have the opportunity really out of this type of involvement together to really launch those initiatives. I'm going to talk about specifically about responding to the impact of armed conflict on children. It's incredibly depressing that we need to be here talking about this when in Europe we're obviously dealing with the issues in Ukraine, in Gaza. We can't forget about Sudan and the 5 million displaced people in Sudan, the million plus children that have died and are starving right now. Also issues in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. We have issues in Asia, the Rohingyas, and so on and so forth. So in our lifetimes, and for some of us who've been around a long time, this is the most critical period of time as it relates to armed conflict, and particularly the impact of armed conflict on children. 500 million children, 20% of the world's children now, are being impacted directly or indirectly by armed conflict, 20%. And so how do I move this forward? Let's see if I can do this. I knew that. Yeah, and so I'm not going to talk about the details about how children are being impacted. I want to talk about solutions to the issue as we sit here today and what we can do. It's not as if there haven't been attempts at addressing these issues. We have human rights declarations, conventions, not the least of which is the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. We have the current Sustainable Development Goals. We have criminal laws and humanitarian laws and international treaties and courts and the Geneva Conventions and so on and so forth. With all of this work that's been done, in particular post-World War II, we're still sitting here without really a way of addressing these critical issues. And so what we want to talk about is, want to put on the table, is the idea of not another convention. And we've talked to folks around the world about WHO and humanitarian and organizations and so on and so forth. What about another convention, and so on and so forth? And at the end point, the response is we don't need another convention. But what we'd like to talk about is an optional protocol. So for those of you who are familiar with human rights and in particular children's rights, we have the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And in addition to the convention, we have general comments that explain and go into detail what some of the articles actually mean. There are about 26 or 28 of those right now, but we have 4 optional protocols, and the optional protocols are more important. They have legal weight to them, and are ratified by countries. And so rather than have another convention, what we're anticipating we'd like to do is actually move the agenda forward of creating another optional protocol to deal with to deal with the issues of armed conflict on children. And in order to make this movement forward, it is critically important that health professionals, pediatricians, and healthcare professionals begin. And I'm not expecting, there's no expectation that you become legal scholars on these issues, but in fact, really have some understanding of the legal manifestations that have been established over the years, and that there's some understanding of the international laws and treaties and so on and so forth that exist between states. Because if we're going to be talking about this and advancing it, we need to have some understanding of what these are. So just a really very brief overview. We have the UN Declaration on Human Rights, which really began all of this work. We have the Geneva Conventions that happened after World War II, obviously. We have the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child and its related optional protocols. We have extensive international humanitarian law and criminal law, which also was, for the most part, developed after World War II. The concept of crimes against humanity, which you see here as the definition, concept of genocide and war crimes, all happened actually after World War II. An interesting story and an interesting history. If you're at least been interested, there's a wonderful book called East West Street, and it's the story of two people, both Jews that were born on the same street, one on the east side, one on the west side. Both of them went into law. One coined the terms crime against humanity and the jurisprudence behind it. The other coined the term genocide and the jurisprudence behind genocide. They did not like one another and vied for power and influence in the trials after World War II. And the story is really interesting. But so these concepts of crimes against humanity and genocide actually happened were generated after World War II, and then the issue of war crimes. All of this, and what I like to say, and a position that ISOP has taken over the last several years, and we'll talk about it in a second. It's not our role to litigate what's genocide, what's war crimes, what's crimes against humanity. It's not our role because if we get too involved with that, then we're taking sides. Our focus is on children and the impact of armed conflict on children. If we stay in that venue, then we can work. As soon as we start using the terms genocide and start talking about crimes against humanity, then that puts us in a place where we lose validity and credibility with a focus specifically on children. So if we knew what was going to happen at our last annual meeting prior to COVID, we had a meeting in Beirut, and after our as part of our annual meetings, in general, we like to create some sort of policy statement or something that deals specifically around the issues related to the focus of the meeting. And out of that came a policy statement, which if you go onto our website, isop.org, you could see the policy statement. And who knew at that point in time, we were certainly dealing with the issues, which is why we had the meeting in Beirut related to Syria and so on. But who knew that within a few years that we'd be dealing with issues related to what's happening in Gaza, what's happening in Sudan, what's happening in Ukraine. So out of that meeting came the Beirut Declaration, and what we were talking about doing now is using the framework of the Beirut Declaration to actually create a framework for an optional protocol. Moving that agenda forward is going to be really difficult. But what I can say is that the voice of pediatricians and child health professionals and psychologists and so on will be critically important as we move this agenda forward. It will take time, but the advocacy from folks that are sitting in this room and your organizations and professional societies and so on will be critically important in moving this agenda forward. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but what we are proposing is that this optional protocol really identify these 7 different articles. The last article, Article 7, is not prominent in the declaration, but to focus on the issues related to targeting children, the impact of children and families on the move, safe and neutral zones, healthcare, care of wounded and sick children, the schools, and then the responsibility of state and non-state actors. Targeting children, we ought not to be targeting children. And we'll disseminate these slides so that you can look at them in more detail. But the specific statements in this optional protocol focused on the issues of targeting children and complying with international humanitarian law and letter and spirit. So the first part of this is a prohibition against targeting children. The second, and we've talked about this, and Suleiman's presentation is quite relevant to this. That first, children must not be separated from parents, that parents and families should not be prevented from moving freely to seek refuge, whether that's internally or externally displaced across borders, and that there needs to be the requirement that children and families can return home, can be repatriated, and that children separated from parents need to be reunited. Creating safe and neutral zones, that those need to be established and maintained, and that all decision making related to the safety of children and the lives of children should be based on the Convention on the Rights of the Child, survival and development without discrimination, free from violence and exploitation, and so on and so forth. So the Convention on the Rights of the Child provides the framework for building safe and neutral zones for children who are displaced internally or externally by armed conflict, the last bullet on this is critically important, and that attacks causing any amount of deaths amongst civilians, and in particular on children, should be recorded, investigated, and that those entities that are causing the harm need to be held accountable. And we'll talk about accountability in a second, but without accountability, there's no teeth in this protocol. Healthcare, that healthcare needs to be available, and it should meet at least the standards in the communities prior to the conflict. There are issues that that there are areas in the world that are engaged in armed conflict that have low levels of resources related to healthcare, and then external entities, the conflict happens, external entities parachute in, healthcare access is improved, but improved primarily and at greater capacity, sophistication than the community had received before. That causes some internal strife. So the intent is that, in fact, that healthcare should at least meet the standards of the community prior to the conflict. And that in accordance with international humanitarian law, healthcare facilities should be respected and protected. That's an interesting, again, we can't go into much detail about this, but in fact, healthcare systems were in the past, hospitals and so on were respected. After the war here in Europe, in the former Yugoslavia, that was really the first time that hospitals and healthcare facilities became targets. And so now they are a primary target in conflict zones. So that needs to be stopped. Doctors and healthcare professionals and personnel should not be targeted as they are now, and that transport of medical equipment and medication should be free and not focus of attacks, which we're seeing now in the conflicts that we're dealing with, in particular in Gaza. So that's another element of the optional protocol. Care of wounded and sick children should be treated according to the highest quality standards available, and that local medical personnel should be voluntarily integrated and supported and trained for the above. This is an aside, which where ISOP is working with a number of evacuation agencies, trying to get kids out of who need care out of Gaza, and we're starting to do so with colleagues from Sudan as well. My expectation was that we would broadcast the need to hospitals and systems in the United States and children's hospitals, and that these kids would be welcomed with open arms. It has proven to be the opposite. That it's been extremely difficult to find children's hospitals in the United States that will receive these kids. We're also having the same difficulty in Europe as well. So any expectation that the world is interested in these care of wounded and sick children who are the impact of armed conflict is just not reality. And those of us that are connected to these hospitals and systems, and those of us who are involved in academic institutions, need to really become advocates for accepting these kids. And we welcome your advocacy and participation. And we need data. So that one of the challenges is to really know and understand what's happening in communities that are impacted by armed conflict, in particular in Syria. That became a very difficult issue. Now in Sudan, also a really very challenging issue to really know what's happening, to know the epidemiology, and different methodologies for capturing that. I'm done here in a second. 2 minutes. We need access to schools, but this last one is really what I wanted to take some time to talk, but not more than 2 minutes for sure. We need to hold state and non-state actors responsible. They need to be accountable, and that accountability needs within our own countries, in particular, looking at the United States and Europe, for those folks those organizations, those countries that are building the bombs, disseminating the bombs, involved with the conflict. Both state and non-state actors, both public and non-public sectors need to be held accountable. And in such an optional protocol, we would look forward to including that in the protocol. And those of us who invest in war industries, either with knowledge or without knowledge, need to be held financially accountable as well. We welcome you to participate for the development implementation of an optional protocol. It needs to prioritize the best interests of children. It needs to have rigorous and accurate data and collection and reporting. needs to include adequate health care for children. It needs to have some sort of governance to enforce prevention mitigation strategy, and needs to have international support and agreement. Have some resources here. We just published a sort of a quick overview of it in BMJPO. We can get that link out to you. It's these first two bullets. And I want to thank you all. I want to invite you to participate in our efforts to advance the right of children to optimal survival and development. We're going to need your support. We're going to need your experience. You're going to need your passion, commitment, and your voice to move this agenda forward. No one knows today how impactful it will be, but unless we move forward today, we'll never know what tomorrow's going to bring. But we're sure if the history determines the future, that there's not going to be a cessation of armed conflict, and we won't stop seeing the impact of armed conflict on children, either directly, but again through forced migration, displacement, and so on. And can't forget that one of the main causes of armed conflict today, but certainly increasingly tomorrow, will be the impact of climate change and the attempt to acquire limited resources into the future. So I want to thank you. I hope you'll join our efforts, and thank our folks that are running this session, and move forward. Thanks.